So Amy and Dwight Hubbard are going to be talking about tools or stumbling blocks that you can encounter when you're learning Python, and I assume how to overcome them. So, thank you.
Okay, so our talk is going to be stumbling blocks of a Python newbie, and I'm Amy.
And I'm Dwight. Wow.
So we came up with this because we actually have a PyLadies study group. We're actually from San Jose, California. And a lot of our group came up with kind of the same frustrations when trying to learn Python that we actually turned into stumbling blocks, so hence the name of our talk. We're going to provide suggestions on how to overcome these challenges and to increase the success of new learners. So a little bit about me. I started to learn Python actually 6 months ago. And I'm a little different. I actually own a pet sitting business and I make pet toys, often using the Raspberry Pi. So I wanted to learn Python in order to make those pet toys. But in the meantime, I found a lot of people who were just like me. So I'm just very passionate about helping people learn Python, especially those not coming from a coding background, in order for them to be successful, so they want to continue on into the field.
All right, and I'm Dwight. I go to the same group as Amy, and I've been using Python for quite a while. I started using Python in 2001. I currently work at Yahoo, where I run Python platforms, and I go to the study groups and basically answer questions and help students when they get frustrated with their study materials. By the way, this talk has absolutely nothing to do with my day job, so anything I say has nothing to do with Yahoo. And like Amy, I am very passionate about teaching.
So these are the list of the 5 main topics that we're going to cover during our talk. So the first one is having one training document for multiple operating systems. The second is lack of consistency, then failure to explain, lack of repetition, and requiring extra knowledge. So one training document for multiple operating systems. As you can tell, we own a couple of cats. So this little kitty's trying to exactly figure out how to open his little toy. So this slide just illustrates it. Using the one training document for the systems can often cause a student to go down the wrong path and to be confused. As you can see, this particular slide lists instructions for Windows, Linux, or Mac, and then how to activate the virtual environment. Moving attention from this document to a terminal or editor was an issue quite frequently for our students. And then when you having to go back to the document, it was accidentally easy to go to the wrong section.
And as a mentor, this problem isn't just for students. Oftentimes we'd be mentoring the students and we go into the terminal window and work through their problem and come back to the training document and be having problems and then realize that we skipped a step, or we skipped back a little earlier in the document, or we accidentally started running commands or operations for the wrong operating system. This transition between the training document and an external training material was a real problem.
So basically our suggestion is to start out by having the student choose which operating system they're using and have them click on it and then only present the instructions for that particular operating system. As you can see, we picked Mac. These are the correct instructions on how to activate a virtual environment and also how to use Python 3.4 in order to help with their training. So our second one is lack of consistency. So this, in relation to this, and again, we pulled examples, and we actually thank people who've written training, whether it be books or online. They've done an excellent job. But one of the things is explaining a concept using specific words, and then in future exercises using different words or word order, which can frequently leave students wondering if it is a new concept being described or the previous concept. And we're just showing some examples. So this is a lot of times what we found in books. You're going to start with call the square function and pass an argument of 5. A couple pages later, call the square function and set the value parameter to 5. Or open a Python prompt. Go into Python interactive mode, and then after running the Python command. So all this is thrown usually within 1 chapter or 2 chapters to a brand new student who really doesn't have a lot of experience using Python. So then what we suggest is, in order to help alleviate students' confusion, so they feel they're learning something, they feel successful at it, make sure that you're going to use consistent phrasing and word order throughout your training document. So to go back to our first example where it states call the square function and pass it an argument of 5, make sure you use that. Don't keep switching it up to parameter, this and that, unless you're going to go through and actually explain to the student what that means.
And another lack of consistency. We have a slide here. The unclear separation between the terminal, editor, and Python shell. Obviously, this doesn't apply as much to people using online courses, but if you want to use Python in the real world, you're going to have to master these utilities. And in training documents where the student is using all 3, and unfortunately the projector makes it a little hard to see, they'll usually have some instructions followed by a gray box that you do in one of these utilities or tools, followed by more instructions in another gray box that looks like the previous one, except they're giving you information for a different tool. And then more instructions, and once again, they put the thing into a gray box. So the first gray box, they may be giving you a shell command to run. The second gray box, they may say, put the information in this gray box into a file in your editor. And the last one may be, hey, go into a Python interactive shell and run these commands. This is really confusing to the student, especially if the students have never used these tools before. They have enough trouble trying to remember how to get into the tool, much less figuring out which window they should be putting what they're typing into. So here's our suggestion. If you're doing training documents, make it very clear what is what. You'll notice that we put a small little header bar that specifies the tool there. Ideally, in a training document, you would also have that be a clickable link so that the person can go back to a fresh window that explains how to get into the tool. This is really important if somebody exits the training and comes back the next day. Because if you're giving people instructions, say, change into this directory and run these shell commands, and then further on, you expect them to be in that directory. Well, if they leave the training and they come back and they can't remember how to get into the directory, that's a problem. And it's a very common one. You'll see that we use different coloring, although it's not obvious on this projector, unfortunately. But the stuff for the terminal window is in blue, and the interactive shell is in gray. We didn't have enough room to actually put an example for a Python prompt, but ideally they should be unique to make it very clear which tool the user should be using. Another variation of this is difference between what the computer types, what the user enters. In shell windows and Python interactive windows, you'll get a gray box, and it basically has a cutout or a screenshot of whatever happens. And that's fine, except for the fact that your user probably doesn't know what a shell prompt is, right? The students may not know. And it is hard to delineate between the prompt, what they're typing, and what the computer responds with. This is really confusing. We suggest, and I actually, after we came up with the suggestion, we noticed some of our training materials have actually started doing this. So bravo. You'll see that we put the little thing there. But you'll notice that the prompt is now a lighter color than the rest of the output. We actually reverse-faced the information that the user would be typing, and the output is in a different shade. It is important to remember you could do that with color, but please keep in mind some people are colorblind. So you can actually make it confusing for them if you're not careful. But this makes it much clearer. The real issue we saw with the students was they would inadvertently type part of the prompt in as part of the command, and they wouldn't get the results that we were expecting. And unfortunately, when you get an error from a shell, the answer or the error message is not very easy to parse for somebody who's not familiar with the tool they're using. Next is failure to explain. You see, this is a cat. It's not actually one of our cats. We just thought it was cute. It has a question mark over the top because it's confused. So in several of the training materials, the example statements would use things like expressions. And they would give examples of things like expressions, but they would never actually explain what expressions are or how they function. And this is true of not only expressions, this is just one of the examples. We saw this in a large number of training materials. And so you get something like this, where it says, the while statement takes a condition, which is an expression that determines if a loop is executed. They didn't explain what an expression is. Examples of something are not a substitution for an explanation. And the problem is if the person who's learning doesn't understand what they're doing, or how it's being applied, or even why they're learning it, they don't have any basis for figuring out what's going on or how to apply it. And what we ran into is when you use examples, when the examples were things that the people were already familiar with, for example, expressions, the example was a math expression, and people use math, they know what 2 plus 2 is, for example. That's pretty easy for them to understand. It makes sense. But then when you get into using function calls as an expression, or things like that, where you're putting in programming concepts as part of the expression, all of a sudden the students don't have familiarity with it. And you didn't explain how expressions work. The students were consistently saying, the training was easy. I was understanding it, and then it got grammatically harder because I couldn't understand the concepts. So obviously, suggestion, explain the concepts, because they're not, an explanation is what the students really need. And take the time to explain how things work and why they're needed. As a mentor, and I'm sure as people writing training materials, this is not easy, but it is worth it. When people understand how the things work and why, their thoughts go from, this has got dramatically harder, to, oh, that makes sense.
So then lack of repetition. Our little kitty had to practice quite often. As I don't know if any of you guys have cats, but our cat nowadays is learning how to pull the mattress down so she can hop on the upstairs kitchen and cause all sorts of havoc. So cats are very smart in that way. So what we came into, and actually I used to teach special needs kids myself, and I know one thing that was very successful, especially when you're learning whatever it is. is to, if you're going to teach a new concept, make sure you give the chance for the student to repeat that concept, to feel like they have a good understanding before moving on to teaching a new concept. So our example here is, we kind of pulled this out of some. So we were talking about lists. Several of them had talked about how to define a list. And then the next page was slicing a list. The next page was accessing a list by index. But by the time the students had the chance to review, they've been taught 10 different concepts about lists. Each concept was isolated, and they didn't actually build on the previous concept. And several of our group members felt like they didn't have a good enough understanding of the code, of this piece of code, before they were required to move on to the next concept. So what we just suggest is that make sure, again, that if you're going to teach two to three new concepts, then give the opportunity for the student to review them. Then go on and teach 2 to 3 more new concepts, and then build, and so you're going to give an example using those 4 new concepts, and then consecutively build your training in that manner. So again, with the previous step, you're going to teach how to slice a list, and then you're going to teach how to access a list. Teach those 2, and then maybe teach them how to append a list or how to define a list, and then basically give them an example using those 4 concepts.
All right, requiring extra knowledge. What do I mean by that? So we have training exercises that use non-Python concepts that aren't used day to day. This is a real problem. This person's trying to learn Python. When you take their attention from learning Python to reviewing concepts that they don't use day to day, you subtract from their ability to learn, because now they're having to review other things. So here's an example. Write a function that takes 2 arguments, a base and an exponent, and returns the first raised to the power of the second. How many of us use those type of math concepts on a daily basis? Yeah, there are a few. I dread giving this talk to a math department.
Yeah.
And the math module is the one that seems to be used a lot of times in these training documents. You have the basic math stuff that people use day to day, but things like exponents and raising to a power, people don't. And the Python standard library has so many things. If you're going to write training materials or teach people, pick a module that they would have something that they use on a daily basis. For example, the string module. People want to scrape websites and things like that. We use words on a regular basis. It would be a much better fit if you're trying to teach how to call functions to use a module like that instead of the math module. All right.
So just to summarize, these are the 5 basic that we just covered during our talk, is to provide a single training document that's an issue for multiple operating systems. Again, we only presented them with Mac, as well as how to activate that virtual environment using Mac. A lack of consistency, so just ensure that you're using the same word and word order, as well as delineate between what the student types and then what the computer does.
Failure to explain. Make sure when you're giving the student concepts, you actually explain them. You don't expect them to pick them up by osmosis. And of course, this is difficult.
A lack of repetition. Make sure, again, when you're teaching new concepts, you give the opportunity for the student to repeat them as well as practice them right after you teach them in order to help them gain their understanding.
And finally, requiring extra knowledge. When you're training people, keep the focus on them learning Python. Don't require them to review concepts that are external to what they're trying to learn. All right, that's the end of our talk.
Yeah, so thank you so much for your time.
All right, we unfortunately don't have time for questions since we've been running a little bit late, but is there a good way for people to get in touch with you if they do have questions? Twitter handle, or just look out for you around?
Twitter handle's Dwight. My Twitter handle's Dwight Hubbard.
Probably just email is the best for me, so my name, add a number 4 to it at gmail.com. Your first slide had it? Yeah, the first slide had there, yep.
Oh.